I helped build this company for 6 years, my wife announced to the packed Vancouver courtroom, her voice steady, with rehearsed confidence. I'm entitled to half of everything, including the $3.8 million from your father's timber rights. That money belongs to both of us now. Judge Morrison glanced down at the thick stack of documents her lawyer had submitted, outlining exactly how she planned to claim half my family's lumber business. My wife sat there in her expensive cashmere coat, the one she'd charged to my account last Christmas, looking like a woman who'd already won. What she didn't know was that my father, old William Bennett, had spent the last year of his life preparing for exactly this moment. My name is Harold Bennett. I'm 63 years old, and I run Bennett Timber Operations out of Prince George, British Columbia. 4 generations of my family have worked these forests, starting when my great-grandfather arrived from Scotland in 1891 with nothing but an axe and a dream. By the time I met my second wife at a forestry conference in Whistler 7 years ago, our company was harvesting over 200,000 cubic meters of timber annually and employed nearly 80 workers across 3 camps. She worked as an environmental consultant then, advising logging companies on sustainable practices. Intelligent, attractive, passionate about the industry. She seemed genuinely interested in how 4 generations of Bennett men had balanced profit with conservation. When she moved into my home, outside Prince George, after 8 months of dating, she fit into my world like she'd always belonged there. She supported me through my father's declining health, sat with him during his dialysis appointments, read to him when his eyesight started failing. She cried at his funeral 18 months ago and promised she'd help me honor his legacy. I thought I'd found my partner for life. I was wrong. The warning signs started small. After my father passed and I inherited his personal estate, including $3.8 million in timber rights he'd accumulated over 60 years. My wife's behavior shifted overnight. Suddenly, she needed expensive renovations to the house, new furniture, a luxury SUV because my truck was embarrassing for a company owner's wife. Weekend trips to Vancouver became monthly expectations. When I mentioned the costs, she'd get defensive. I gave up my consulting career to support your business, Harold. This is what successful couples do. My father had insisted on a prenuptial agreement before our wedding. It's not about love, son, he'd said in that quiet, measured way of his. It's about protecting what 4 generations built for the 5th. The forests don't care about feelings. Neither should your legal documents. My wife had resisted, calling it old-fashioned and insulting. But eventually, she signed, claiming she hadn't bothered reading all that legal nonsense because she trusted me completely. What she definitely hadn't read, what nobody except my father's lawyer, Douglas Chen, and I knew, was the special clause my father had buried in his will. A little insurance policy for exactly this situation. The inheritance wasn't actually mine yet. According to my father's will, I could only claim the full $3.8 million after 5 years of demonstrably stable marriage. But there was a trigger clause that would release the money immediately. If my spouse ever filed for divorce, demanding a share of the inheritance itself, the funds would transfer to me as permanent, separate property. My father had called it his character test. Sitting in that courtroom, watching my wife's lawyer argue why she deserved millions she'd never earned, I couldn't help but feel my father's presence. His wisdom was about to reach from beyond the grave and teach my wife the most expensive lesson of her life. Let me go back and tell you how I met the woman who tried to steal my family's legacy. It was September 2019 at the British Columbia Forestry Association conference in Whistler. I was there speaking on sustainable harvesting practices when this striking woman approached me during the lunch break. Professional blazer, firm handshake, genuine knowledge about timber management, not exactly common among environmental consultants, who usually saw loggers as the enemy. Catherine Marsh, she introduced herself. I work with Pacific Environmental Solutions, but I've always believed logging and conservation can coexist. My grandfather was a faller in the Okanagan. We talked for 3 hours. She asked intelligent questions about our selective harvesting methods, seemed impressed by our family's 4-generation commitment to the land. When I mentioned we'd started with just a handsaw and a single horse, she got this look in her eyes, like she was seeing something remarkable. That's beautiful, Harold. Building something that lasts across generations. That's real success. I was captivated. At 63, after losing my first wife, Margaret, to cancer 5 years earlier, I'd accepted that companionship might be behind me. Catherine seemed like a gift I hadn't expected. She moved to Prince George 2 months later, claiming her company was expanding operations in the interior. Looking back, the timing was awfully convenient. We dated for 8 months before she suggested moving in. She was attentive and supportive, made my empty house feel like a home again for the first time since Margaret's death. When my father's kidney disease worsened in early 2020, Catherine was remarkable. Drove him to dialysis appointments when I couldn't get away from the camps, sat with him during treatments, brought him homemade soup when he was too weak to eat. At his funeral, she held me, while I grieved and promised she'd help me honor his legacy. He raised a good man, she whispered. I'll spend my life proving I'm worthy of the Bennett name. The proposal came naturally 6 months later. My father was still alive then, though weakening daily. When I told him I was planning to ask Catherine to marry me, his expression grew serious. Son, I need you to listen carefully. Get a prenuptial agreement. Dad, come on. Catherine's not like that. Maybe not, but you're about to inherit everything 4 generations of Bennett men built. A prenup isn't about her character. It's about protecting the 5th generation and the 6th and every generation after. He was right, of course. When I raised the subject with Catherine, her reaction was telling. Are you serious, Harold? After everything I've done for your father, for you want me to sign some contract saying I'm a gold digger? It's just standard protection, Catherine. Douglas Chen handles all our legal matters. He says anyone with significant assets should. Douglas Chen isn't marrying you. I am. This is insulting. The argument lasted 4 days. She threatened to call off the engagement twice. But eventually, she agreed, mainly because my father made it clear there wouldn't be a wedding without it. Fine, but I'm not reading 50 pages of legal garbage that basically says you don't trust me. She signed it without looking past the first page. The wedding was simple, a small ceremony at the Prince George Golf and Curling Club, reception for family and close friends. Catherine looked radiant, played the perfect bride. During our vows, she promised to protect and honor the Bennett legacy for generations to come. My father pulled me aside during the reception. He looked tired, worn down by years of dialysis and declining health. I updated my will last week, he said quietly. Douglas has the details. Just trust the process, son, no matter what happens. I didn't understand then. I thought he was just being overcautious, maybe a little paranoid from all the medication. But old William Bennett had built an empire by thinking 3 moves ahead of everyone else. Even at 84, his mind was sharp as the axes we used to fell timber. My father passed in March 2023, 18 months after our wedding. Kidney failure finally won the battle he'd fought for nearly a decade. I held his hand in those final moments, and his last words to me were, "Trust Douglas, follow the plan." The funeral was harder than I'd imagined. Losing the man who taught me everything about forestry, about business, about being a Bennett. Catherine was wonderful during those dark weeks. She handled all the arrangements I couldn't face, coordinated with the minister, ensured my father received the send-off he deserved. A week later, Douglas Chen called me into his office for the will reading. Just Catherine and me in his oak-paneled conference room, the same place where my father had negotiated timber contracts worth millions over the decades. "Harold, your father has left you a substantial inheritance," Douglas began, his voice carrying that formal tone lawyers use for important moments. "The estate totals $3.8 million in timber rights, investments, and savings. However, there are specific conditions. I knew my father had money saved, but $3.8 million was more than I'd imagined." Catherine squeezed my hand, tears in her eyes. "What kind of conditions?" I asked. Douglas adjusted his glasses. "The inheritance becomes fully accessible after 5 years of demonstrably stable marriage. Until then, it remains in trust." However, he paused, glancing at Catherine. "There are circumstances under which the 5-year waiting period would be waived." "What circumstances?" Catherine asked, speaking up for the first time. "If the surviving spouse initiates divorce proceedings and specifically claims community property rights to the inheritance itself, the waiting period is immediately voided, and Harold gains full access to all funds." I didn't understand the significance then. It seemed like just another one of my father's complicated business maneuvers. Catherine nodded along, like it made perfect sense. "So basically, if I'm patient and faithful, we get the money in 5 years anyway?" I asked. "Precisely. Your father wanted to ensure the inheritance went to a man who'd built a stable, lasting marriage." Looking back, I should have paid more attention to Catherine's expression during that explanation, the way her eyes narrowed slightly when Douglas mentioned the trigger clause. But I was grieving, trying to keep the company running without my father's guidance, dealing with insurance companies and estate lawyers. I missed the signs that Catherine was already calculating. The changes started immediately after the will reading. Small at first, Catherine began asking detailed questions about company finances. Not supportive, "How was your day?" questions, but specific inquiries about quarterly revenues, equipment values, timber contracts. "I want to understand what we're building together," she'd say. "If I'm going to be a Bennett wife, I should know how Bennett money works." Her spending accelerated, too. The grocery bills doubled as she bought expensive, imported everything. Her spa treatments went from monthly to weekly. She joined an exclusive fitness club in Prince George that cost $400 a month. When I mentioned the increased expenses, she'd remind me about the inheritance. "We're going to be millionaires in 5 years, Harold. I'm just adjusting our lifestyle to match our future reality." Then came the bigger purchases. A diamond bracelet for our first anniversary that cost $20,000. A luxury vehicle, because your truck doesn't fit the image of a successful businessman's wife. Complete renovation of the kitchen my father had built in 1978. The credit card statements grew thicker each month. Catherine always had explanations. She was networking at expensive restaurants to help my business, buying clothes for important industry events, investing in her appearance, because successful men need wives who look the part. By our second anniversary, she'd accumulated nearly $90,000 in charges. When I suggested maybe we should slow down the spending, her reaction was explosive. "Are you kidding me, Harold? I gave up my career to support yours. I take care of this house. I attend every boring industry function. I smile and make small talk with your workers as wives. The least you can do is trust me with financial decisions." "It's not about trust, Catherine. It's about responsibility. We're spending money we don't actually have yet." "We will have it. Your father's will guarantees that." Something about the way she said it, cold and calculated, sent a chill down my spine. The third player in this drama lived on the adjacent property, a 100-acre parcel that bordered our family land. Martin Sawyer, 58, divorced mill operator who'd bought the place about 4 years ago. Decent enough fellow on the surface. We'd chat occasionally when our paths crossed on the logging roads. I'd even helped him repair his equipment shed after a windstorm. What I didn't know was that Martin had a very personal reason to resent the Bennett family. It started in 2015 when Martin saw a mill bid on a major contract with us, processing our timber for export to Asian markets. Martin had leveraged everything for that deal: his mill, his house, his marriage. He was so confident he'd win that he'd already hired additional workers and upgraded his equipment. The contract went to a mill in Quesnel instead. Our quality control team had found Martin's processing standards inconsistent with too many rejected boards and complaints from previous customers. We made the smart business decision, but Martin never saw it that way. Losing that contract devastated his operation. Within a year, the dominoes fell fast after that. Bank foreclosed on half his equipment. Wife filed for divorce. Took what little remained. Martin blamed the Bennett family for destroying his life. And 9 years later, he was still carrying that bitterness. When he bought the property next to ours in 2020, right after my father's health started declining, I thought it was just coincidence. The interior is vast, but the forestry community is surprisingly small. I even felt sympathy for the man. Divorced, struggling, trying to rebuild. I went out of my way to be neighborly. Martin played his role perfectly. The grateful neighbor, the man who'd learned from his mistakes, the divorced fellow, just trying to start over. He'd stop by occasionally for advice about logging road maintenance. Always respectful, always appreciative of any help. But Martin Sawyer was playing a much longer game. He was watching, learning our routines, paying attention to Catherine's behavior, especially after my father's inheritance became known. He noticed her spending habits, her increasingly expensive tastes, the way she talked about money when she thought no one was listening. Martin recognized something in Catherine that I was too blind to see, the same calculating greed that had poisoned his own marriage, but refined and patient, and he realized she could be the perfect weapon for his revenge against the Bennett family. The first contact came about 8 months ago. Catherine was walking on our property near the boundary when Martin approached with a bottle of wine and a sympathetic ear. "I couldn't help but notice you seem stressed lately," he told her. "Divorce is difficult. I've been through it myself." "We're not divorcing," Catherine corrected. "Harold and I are happy." Of course. I just meant, well, marriage can be complicated when there's significant money involved. I learned that lesson the hard way." From there, Martin began his careful cultivation. Casual conversations at the property line about difficult husbands who don't appreciate what they have, stories about his own divorce, how his ex-wife fought for what she deserved, suggestions about financial independence and women's rights in marriage. Catherine was receptive, more than receptive. She was hungry for validation of feelings she'd been hiding from me. Martin provided a sympathetic ear, and more importantly, practical advice from someone who'd navigated a high-stakes divorce. "The key," Martin told her one evening in May, "is documentation. You need to understand exactly what assets are involved, what your rights are, what strategies work best." He recommended his former divorce lawyer, Amanda Price, gave Catherine the name of the forensic accountant who'd worked his case, Robert Fielding. He shared tactics about gathering financial information, building a case for maximum settlement. Martin wasn't just helping Catherine plan a divorce, he was weaponizing her against my family. Every piece of advice, every recommendation, every sympathetic conversation was designed to inflict maximum damage on the Bennett legacy. The beautiful thing was I had no idea. Martin maintained his friendly neighbor act perfectly, still waved when he saw me, still asked to borrow equipment occasionally. even expressed concern when he noticed Catherine seemed a little distant lately. "Hope everything's okay with you too," he'd say with perfect false concern. Marriage can be tough, especially with business pressures. If only I'd known that my helpful neighbor was systematically dismantling my marriage from the inside, using my wife's own greed as the weapon. The discovery came by accident, like most betrayals do. It was a Thursday afternoon in June. I'd come home early from one of our camps near McBride because of a mechanical breakdown, expecting to find Catherine at her usual book club meeting. Instead, I heard voices coming from our kitchen. "The prenup might have a weakness regarding business appreciation," Catherine was saying. "If I can prove my domestic support contributed to company growth during our marriage," I froze in the hallway, recognizing Martin's voice, responding, "Amanda Price is the best divorce lawyer in the interior." She found exactly that angle in my case. The key is proving your non-financial contributions increased the business value. My stomach dropped. My wife was in my kitchen, plotting my financial destruction with my neighbor. "What about the inheritance?" Catherine asked. "That's trickier. But Robert Fielding knows how to dig deep. He found assets my ex-wife thought she'd hidden worth every dollar of his $12,000 fee. $12,000 for a forensic accountant to destroy me." I backed out quietly, sat in my truck in the driveway for 20 minutes, trying to process what I just heard. The woman I loved, the woman who'd held my hand at my father's funeral, was actively working to rob me blind. That night, I confronted her. "Catherine, we need to talk." "About what?" She was folding laundry, acting perfectly normal. "About your conversation with Martin today, about divorce lawyers and forensic accountants." Her hands stopped moving for just a moment. Her mask slipped, and I saw something cold and calculating in her eyes. "Harold, you're being paranoid. I heard you, Catherine, in our kitchen planning how to take my inheritance." She sat down slowly, and I saw her mentally shifting gears, trying a different approach. "Okay, yes, I've been talking to Martin about options, but not because I want to divorce, Harold. Because I'm scared." "Scared of what?" "Of you, of how you've changed since your father died. You're distant, suspicious, controlling about money. I consulted a lawyer to understand my rights, to know where I stand if things get worse." It was masterful manipulation, taking my discovery of her betrayal and flipping it into my fault, my problem, my failure as a husband. "I'm not trying to hurt you," she continued, tears starting to flow. "I just want to feel secure in our marriage." And here's the thing. I almost believed her. Almost. 3 weeks later, I got sick. Some kind of flu that hit me hard. The kind that knocks you flat for days. I was practically helpless, running a fever, could barely keep water down. Catherine transformed back into the woman I'd married, bringing me soup, checking my temperature, sleeping on the couch so I could rest better. "I love you, Harold," she whispered one evening, sitting by my bedside. "I know things have been tense lately, but we'll figure it out. We're Bennetts now. We stick together." She was perfect, attentive, caring, genuinely worried about my health. She even donated some of her expensive clothes to charity, saying she'd been too materialistic lately. As I recovered, doubt crept in. Had I misjudged her? Was Martin the real problem, poisoning her mind with his bitter divorce experience? Maybe my father's elaborate will conditions were overkill, the paranoid creation of a dying man who'd spent too many years in cutthroat business negotiations. I started questioning everything. The prenup seemed harsh. The 5-year inheritance waiting period felt manipulative. Maybe Catherine deserved better than a husband who'd set traps in their marriage from day one. I called Douglas Chen, my father's lawyer, and asked him to meet for coffee. "I'm thinking about modifying my father's will," I told him, at a coffee shop downtown. The conditions feel unfair to Catherine. Douglas studied me over his coffee cup, the same intense look he'd given opposing counsel in countless negotiations. Harold, your father spent months crafting those conditions. He wasn't just protecting money. He was protecting you. From what? From my wife? From anyone who would see the Bennett legacy as an opportunity rather than a responsibility. I laid out Catherine's recent behavior, her caring during my illness, my growing guilt about my father's seemingly harsh conditions. Douglas listened patiently, then leaned forward. Son, your father told me something before he died. He said the real test wouldn't be whether Catherine tried to take the money. It would be whether you were strong enough to let her reveal herself. What do you mean? He knew you might have moments like this, moments where love clouds judgment, where you'd want to believe the best despite evidence to the contrary. That's why the conditions are ironclad, to protect you from your own good heart. Douglas pulled out a manila envelope. Your father asked me to give you this if you ever wavered. He recorded it 2 weeks before he died. Inside was a USB drive labeled for Harold when trust becomes dangerous. That evening, I sat alone in my home office and plugged in my father's USB drive. A video file opened showing my father sitting in his favorite chair just weeks before his death. He looked frail but alert, his voice still carrying that quiet authority I'd known my whole life. Harold, if you're watching this, it means you're having doubts about the inheritance conditions. That's natural, son. You've got a good heart, maybe too good for your own protection. Even on the screen, my father's presence filled the room. I need to tell you something I never said while I was alive. I didn't trust Catherine from the beginning, not because she was evil, but because she saw our family's success as an opportunity to be exploited rather than a legacy to be protected. My stomach clenched as he continued. I hired a private investigator 8 months after you started dating her. Background check, financial history, previous relationships. What I found wasn't criminal, but it was illuminating. My father reached off camera and held up a folder. Catherine Marsh has a pattern, son. 2 previous relationships with financially successful men. Each relationship lasted just long enough to establish financial entanglement, then ended with her taking as much as possible. A real estate developer in Calgary, she lived with him for 3 years, then sued him for spousal support, an investment banker in Edmonton. 18 months after their engagement ended, she was driving his Mercedes and living in a condo he paid for. I felt sick. The woman I'd loved, trusted, married, she moved to Prince George specifically to target you, Harold. The forestry conference wasn't coincidence. She researched attendees, identified the most successful unmarried prospects. You were her primary target from day one. My father leaned closer to the camera. The inheritance conditions aren't just about protecting money. They're about protecting you from someone who sees you as a transaction rather than a person. If Catherine truly loves you, she'll wait 5 years and be happy with whatever you build together. If she's what I think she is, she'll show her true colors the moment she realizes the inheritance is within reach. The video ended with my father's final words. Trust the process, son. Let her reveal herself. I sat in the darkness for an hour, absorbing the implications. My marriage was built on deception. My wife was a professional predator, and my father had known all along. But my father's conditions were brilliant in their simplicity. Catherine could have everything legitimately if she was patient and genuine. The only way she'd lose was if her greed overwhelmed her judgment. 2 weeks later, Catherine made her move. I came home to find her packing suitcases in our bedroom. Designer clothes folded neatly, jewelry box already sealed shut. Going somewhere? I asked. She looked up with an expression I'd never seen before. Cold, calculated, completely devoid of the warmth I'd fallen in love with. Harold, this isn't working. We want different things. I want a partner who trusts me, who treats me as an equal. You want a wife who'll wait around for 5 years hoping for scraps from your father's table. The mask was finally off. I've consulted with a lawyer, she continued, Amanda Price. She believes I have excellent grounds for claiming half the marital assets, including a portion of your inheritance. The inheritance isn't marital property, Catherine. The prenup. The prenup has weaknesses. My lawyer found case law suggesting that domestic support during marriage can create claims on previously separate assets, especially if those assets appreciated due to the supported spouse's business success. She was reciting legal arguments like she'd memorized them. Martin's coaching had been thorough. I'm filing for divorce tomorrow, she announced. This doesn't have to be ugly, Harold. Give me what I deserve, half of everything, including half that inheritance, and we can both move on with our lives. I almost smiled. Almost. Catherine had just triggered the exact conditions my father had predicted, the precise scenario that would activate his trap. We'll let the lawyers figure out what you deserve, I said. Catherine smiled that cold, calculating smile. My lawyer says British Columbia is a community property province. 6 years of marriage, significant assets acquired during that time, documented domestic support contributing to business success. The math is simple, Harold. What Catherine didn't understand was that the math had already been done by a man who'd spent 60 years outsmarting people just like her. She moved out that weekend, confident in her coming victory. Through Martin, she'd hired Robert Fielding, the forensic accountant, who produced a comprehensive report on my assets. The business valuation, timber rights, equipment holdings, investment accounts, and especially the $3.8 million inheritance. Catherine's legal team had done their homework. They'd found the potential weakness in the prenup, researched community property precedents, calculated their maximum demand. What they didn't know was that all their research, all their strategy, all their careful planning had just handed me the ultimate victory. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday morning. Catherine was demanding 50% of all marital assets, including what her lawyer called community interest in inherited property due to spousal support, contributing to asset preservation and growth during marriage. In plain English, she wanted $1.9 million of my father's money. Douglas Chen called me within an hour of receiving his copy. Harold, congratulations. Catherine just activated your father's inheritance clause. What exactly does that mean? It means you now have full immediate access to the $3.8 million with no waiting period. By demanding a share of the inheritance in divorce proceedings, Catherine triggered the exact condition your father specified for immediate distribution. I sat down hard. My father's trap had worked perfectly. But there's more, Douglas continued. I need you to come in tomorrow. We have some preparation to do before the court date. At Douglas's office the next morning, he spread out documents across his conference table like a general planning a battle. Catherine's lawyer, Amanda Price, is competent. She found the potential weakness in your prenup, the argument that spousal support during marriage can create community interest in separate property that appreciates in value. Is that a real threat? Douglas smiled grimly. Under normal circumstances? Possibly. There's British Columbia case law that supports her argument, but Catherine made a crucial error. He pulled out a thick folder labeled Forensic Analysis Report. Robert Fielding. Catherine hired Fielding to document your assets for the divorce. She paid him $12,000 to prove her case. What she didn't realize is that everything Fielding documented becomes evidence in the proceedings. Douglas opened the report. Page after page of financial details, property values, business assessments, all of it compiled by Catherine's own accountant. Here's the beautiful irony, Harold. Fielding's report actually helps us. Look at page 37. I read the highlighted section. Subject's business showed minimal growth during marriage period 2018 to 2024. Revenue declined 14% in 2023 due to lumber price fluctuations and increased competition. No evidence that domestic spousal support contributed to business value preservation. Catherine paid $12,000 for a report that destroys her own legal argument, Douglas observed. Fielding concluded that not only didn't her spousal support help the business grow, the business actually declined in value during your marriage. But there was more. Martin Sawyer made a mistake too. He referred Catherine to his divorce team, Price and Fielding, but Martin's divorce case was public record. I pulled the files yesterday. Douglas handed me another folder. Martin's 2016 divorce showed a pattern of deception, hidden assets, and financial manipulation that had ultimately backfired on him spectacularly. Martin lost everything because he got too greedy, tried to hide assets from his ex-wife, and ended up in contempt of court. Now he's coaching Catherine to make the same mistakes. Price is using the same strategies that failed in Martin's case. The picture was becoming clear. Catherine had surrounded herself with advisors whose previous case was a spectacular failure, and she'd hired an accountant who'd accidentally proven she had no legal claim to my inheritance. "What's our strategy?" I asked. Douglas leaned back in his chair. "We're going to give Catherine exactly what she asked for. A full legal proceeding, where all the evidence gets presented. The prenup, your father's will, Fielding's forensic report, Martin's involvement, Catherine's spending patterns, everything." Over the next week, Douglas assembled our case like a master craftsman. He subpoenaed Catherine's financial records, which showed the $90,000 in credit card debt she'd accumulated. He documented her consultations with multiple divorce lawyers, proving premeditation. He even found text messages between Catherine and Martin discussing strategy. The key, Douglas explained, is that Catherine has to prove two things to break the prenup. First, that her domestic support contributed to business growth during marriage, and second, that the inheritance should be considered marital property, despite being explicitly excluded in your prenuptial agreement. Can she prove either? Not only can't she prove them, her own evidence disproves them. Fielding's report shows the business decline during your marriage, contradicting any claim that her support helped it grow, and by demanding the inheritance in divorce proceedings, she triggered your father's clause, making it permanently and irrevocably separate property. Douglas pulled out one final document. Your father left a letter to be read in court if this situation ever arose. Would you like to read it first? The letter was 2 pages written in my father's careful handwriting to any court considering my son's divorce proceedings. The inheritance conditions in my will were designed specifically to distinguish between a spouse who genuinely loves my son and one who sees him as a financial opportunity. Any spouse who truly cares for Harold's well-being would never jeopardize his financial security by demanding a share of inheritance meant to protect our family legacy. The act of making such a demand reveals the demander's true character and automatically disqualifies them from any benefit. This inheritance was earned through 4 generations of honest work and should only pass to those who understand its purpose, protecting the 5th generation and beyond. I looked up at Douglas. He really did think of everything. Your father spent 60 years dealing with people who wanted what he'd built without earning it. Catherine never stood a chance. The court date was set for the following Monday. Catherine's lawyer had requested an expedited hearing, confident in their case. They had no idea they were walking into a trap 60 years in the making. Monday morning arrived cold and gray, typical November weather in Vancouver. I sat in the courthouse parking lot for 10 minutes, watching Catherine and her legal team walk up the steps. She wore that expensive cashmere coat again and carried herself with complete confidence. Martin Sawyer sat in the back row when I entered the courtroom, wearing a suit I'd never seen before. He nodded at me like we were still friendly neighbors, like he hadn't spent months coaching my wife to destroy me financially. Judge Morrison called the court to order at 9 o'clock sharp. She was known for running efficient proceedings and having little patience for legal theatrics. Amanda Price, Catherine's lawyer, stood to deliver her opening statement. She was everything Martin had promised: sharp, experienced, confident. Your Honor, this is a straightforward case of property division. Mrs. Bennett sacrificed her career to support her husband's business endeavors. During their 6-year marriage, she provided domestic support that directly contributed to the preservation and growth of marital assets, including inherited property that appreciated in value due to her contributions. Catherine nodded along, playing the role of wronged wife perfectly. Mrs. Bennett is entitled to half of all marital property, including community interest in the inherited estate that benefited from her support. We're requesting $1.9 million from the inheritance, plus half of all other marital assets and reasonable spousal support. Price gestured toward a stack of documents. We have comprehensive evidence of asset values, business growth patterns, and Mrs. Bennett's substantial non-financial contributions to the marriage. Judge Morrison listened impassively, then turned to Douglas Chen, counsel for the respondent. Douglas stood slowly, carrying only a thin manila folder. Your Honor, the petitioner has indeed provided comprehensive evidence. Unfortunately for her case, that evidence proves she has no legal claim whatsoever to any portion of my client's inheritance. He opened the folder and removed 2 documents. I'd like to present these items for the court's review. First, the prenuptial agreement signed by both parties, explicitly excluding all inherited property from community assets. Judge Morrison accepted the document, scanning the relevant sections. Second, Douglas continued, the last will and testament of William Bennett, my client's deceased father, containing specific conditions regarding inheritance distribution. The judge's eyebrows rose as she read the will. Mr. Chen, she said slowly, am I reading this correctly? The inheritance was conditional upon the marriage lasting 5 years without divorce proceedings claiming community property in the inherited assets. That is correct, Your Honor. By filing for divorce and specifically demanding a share of the inheritance, Mrs. Bennett has triggered the clause that immediately transfers all inherited property to my client as separate, non-marital assets. The courtroom erupted. Catherine's face went white as she realized what had just happened. Price was frantically flipping through her own copies of the documents, trying to understand how she'd missed this. Furthermore, Douglas continued, I'd like to present evidence that Mrs. Bennett's claim of contributing to business growth is contradicted by her own forensic report. He handed Judge Morrison the accountant's findings. Mrs. Bennett paid $12,000 for Robert Fielding to document my client's assets. Mr. Fielding's own conclusions state that the business declined in value during the marriage and that there's no evidence spousal support contributed to asset preservation. Judge Morrison read Fielding's report, shaking her head slightly. So the petitioner hired a forensic accountant who disproved her own case. Essentially, yes, Your Honor. Catherine was whispering urgently to Amanda Price, who looked like she wanted to disappear. In the back row, Martin Sawyer had gone pale. Judge Morrison set down the documents and removed her glasses, studying Catherine with an expression that could freeze water. Mrs. Bennett, she began, her voice carrying the authority of 30 years on the bench, let me make sure I understand your position. You hired a forensic accountant to catalog your husband's assets for divorce proceedings. You consulted with multiple lawyers about maximizing your settlement, and you specifically demanded half of an inheritance that was explicitly excluded from marital property in a prenuptial agreement you signed. Catherine tried to respond, but the judge held up her hand. More importantly, you made this demand knowing that your father-in-law had structured his will to test exactly this scenario. By claiming community property rights to inherited assets, you triggered a clause that permanently removes any possibility of your benefiting from that inheritance. Your Honor, Amanda Price interrupted, we'd like to challenge the validity of both the prenuptial agreement and the inheritance conditions on grounds of unconscionability. Judge Morrison turned her attention to Catherine's lawyer with barely concealed irritation. Counselor, your client was represented by independent legal counsel when she signed the prenuptial agreement. She had every opportunity to negotiate terms or refuse to sign. The inheritance conditions are equally clear and were established by the deceased's right to dispose of his property as he saw fit. Douglas Chen stood. Your Honor, I have one additional piece of evidence, a letter from the deceased to be read in precisely these circumstances. He handed her my father's final letter. Judge Morrison read it silently, and I saw something that might have been respect cross her features. This is remarkable, she said quietly, then louder. The court finds that Mrs. Bennett's demand for inherited property has activated the testamentary conditions established by William Bennett. The prenuptial agreement is valid and enforceable. Mrs. Bennett has no claim to inherited assets, business property, acquired before marriage, or any assets specifically excluded in the prenuptial agreement. Catherine made a sound like she'd been physically struck. Furthermore, the judge continued, the court notes with displeasure the calculated nature of Mrs. Bennett's actions.